I need to tell you something that will sound absolutely impossible. Yet I swear on every principle I've held dear across my many years, it is the truest thing I've ever spoken. In the year 2026, humanity will face a choice so profound, so definitive, that the entire trajectory of your species will pivot on what you decide in those 12 months. And I've seen it. Not with my mortal eyes, mind you, for those closed long ago, but through a strange doorway in time that opened to me in my final days, a vision so vivid it burned itself into my consciousness like lightning etching patterns into wood. You're wondering if old Benjamin has finally lost his wits, aren't you? That's fair. I'd wonder the same thing if someone told me such a tale. But hear me out, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just a prophecy or some mystical fortune-telling. It's a warning, wrapped in an invitation. It's the culmination of everything I learned about human nature, about electricity, about invention, about revolution, about the delicate art of holding a civilization together when every force seems determined to tear it apart. The year 2026 isn't special because the numbers add up to something magical. It's special because it represents a convergence, a perfect storm where your technological progress, your environmental challenges, your political tensions, and your spiritual hunger will all collide in the same moment. You'll be standing at a crossroads with one path leading to a future more magnificent than anything I could have imagined in my wildest Philadelphia nights, and another path leading to something I witnessed that chilled me to my very soul. I know what you're thinking right now. You're tired of doom and gloom. You're exhausted from everyone telling you the sky is falling, that everything's broken, that hope is naive. I understand. Truly, I do. But this isn't that kind of message. This is something entirely different. This is about power. Your power. The power that's sitting dormant inside you right now, waiting for you to remember what you actually are. Let me take you back to a moment in my life, and then I promise, everything will make sense. It's the winter of 1776, and I'm in France, trying to convince an entire nation to risk their wealth and their soldiers on what everyone believes is a hopeless cause. A ragtag collection of farmers trying to defeat the greatest military power on earth. Everyone thinks we're insane. Everyone thinks we'll be crushed. And honestly, on paper, they're absolutely right, but I knew something they didn't. I knew that the most powerful force in the universe isn't weapons or money or armies. It's an idea whose time has come. It's the moment when enough people decide that the impossible is actually inevitable. That's where you are right now. You're in 1776, except the revolution isn't against a king. It's against something far more insidious. It's against the voice in your own head that tells you you're too small to matter, the problems are too big, that someone else will figure it out, that your choices don't ripple outward. That wisdom from an old printer who played with kites is irrelevant to your modern world of screens and algorithms and artificial intelligence. But here's what I saw in that vision, and why I'm speaking to you across centuries. In 2026, there will be a moment, probably so quiet you might miss it entirely, where you'll have to choose between comfort and transformation. Between the familiar path that's slowly killing everything you love, and the unknown path that terrifies you because it demands you become someone new. Most people will choose comfort. They'll choose the numbness. They'll choose to stay asleep. And I watched, in that vision, as their lights dimmed one by one, until entire cities looked dark from above, not because the electricity failed, but because the human spirit inside those buildings simply gave up. But then I saw something else. I saw the others, the ones who chose differently. And my God, the light that came from those people. It was like watching a new kind of electricity being discovered, except it was coming from inside human beings. They were connected in ways that made my experiments with lightning look like child's play. They were solving problems that seemed unsolvable. They were creating abundance where everyone else saw scarcity. They were laughing and building and loving with an intensity that made me weep with joy. And you want to know the strangest part? Both groups were living in the same year, on the same planet, under the same sun. The only difference was the choice they made. The only difference was whether they remembered what I'm about to share with you, or whether they forgot. So yes, this is a prophecy, but it's not about fate. It's about possibility. It's about what becomes available when you understand the principles that govern reality itself, the ones I spent my entire life discovering, testing, and proving. These aren't mystical ideas. They're as practical as electricity, as reliable as compound interest, as revolutionary as the printing press. And in 2026, they're going to be the only things that matter. Are you ready? Because once you hear this, once you really understand what I'm about to tell you, you can't unhear it. You can't go back to sleepwalking. You'll be awake. And being awake in a sleeping world is both the greatest gift and the heaviest responsibility you'll ever carry. But I believe you can handle it. Actually, I know you can. Because you're here right now, listening to a dead man's wisdom, which means you're already different. You're already searching. You're already halfway there. Let me tell you what 2026 actually is. It's not some distant future anymore. It's right around the corner, close enough to touch, close enough to prepare for. And what I'm going to share with you isn't about preparing your pantry or your bank account, though wisdom in those areas never hurts. This is about preparing your mind, your heart, your spirit for what's coming. Because the real catastrophe isn't what might happen to the economy or the climate or the political systems. The real catastrophe is people going through the most important year of their lives and missing it entirely because they were distracted by noise. I lived through the birth of a nation. I watched impossible things become real because people believed they could. I discovered that lightning and tiny sparks from my experiments were the same thing, just at different scales. I learned that a penny saved is a penny earned, yes. But more importantly, I learned that small actions, repeated consistently, compound into forces that reshape reality. Everything I did, everything I learned, every maxim I shared in Poor Richard's almanac, was pointing toward this understanding. You are far more powerful than you've been taught to believe. And the universe operates on principles that, once understood, give you access to possibilities that look like magic to everyone else. In 2026, you're going to need to know these principles like your life depends on it. Because, in ways both literal and metaphorical, it does. Not just your life, but the lives of everyone connected to you, and they're connected to everyone connected to them. And suddenly we're talking about the entire human family. That's not pressure. That's perspective. That's you remembering what you actually are. Not an isolated fragment struggling alone, but a crucial thread in the most magnificent tapestry ever woven. Now, I'm going to do something unconventional. I'm going to tell you exactly what this conversation is about. No tricks, no manipulation. I'm going to share with you 7 principles that governed my life, and that I saw in that vision, governing the lives of those who thrived in 2026X. Then I'm going to tell you stories that prove these principles work. Then I'm going to show you how to practice them starting today. And finally, I'm going to issue you a challenge that will change everything if you accept it. But here's the key. I'm not doing this to be remembered or celebrated. I'm doing this because in that vision, I was given a gift. I was shown that wisdom doesn't die. It echoes forward. And when it reaches the right ears, at the right moment, it ignites something unstoppable. You are the right ears. This is the right moment. So let's begin where all true transformation begins. With the courage to see things as they really are, not as we've been told they are. The world you're living in right now is addicted to complexity. Everyone wants to make things complicated because complicated feels important. Complicated feels sophisticated. But I learned something making bifocals and stoves and lightning rods. The most powerful truths are elegant in their simplicity. They're so obvious once you see them that you almost can't believe you missed them. And that's what these 7 principles are. They're hiding in plain sight. They've been here all along. You've probably heard versions of them your whole life. But in 2026, you won't be able to afford to just hear them. You'll need to live them. The first principle is this: energy flows where attention goes. And attention is the most valuable currency you possess. I discovered electricity by paying attention to what everyone else ignored. That tiny spark, that strange sensation, that weird thing that happened when you rubbed certain materials together. Everyone saw it. I studied it. Do you see the difference? In your world, you're surrounded by more information in one day than I encountered in my entire lifetime. And 99% of it is designed to steal your attention and convert it into someone else's profit. Your attention is being harvested like crops, and you're not even charging rent. In 2026, there will be an attention crisis unlike anything humanity has faced. The technology designed to capture your focus will become so sophisticated, so personalized, so seemingly helpful that billions of people will simply drift away into digital dreams while the real world transforms around them. They'll be distracted during the most important moment of their lives. They'll look up years later and wonder what happened, why they feel so empty, why nothing worked out the way they hoped. And the answer will be simple. They gave away their attention. They spent their most valuable currency on things that didn't matter. But you're not going to do that. You're going to become a master of your own attention. You're going to treat your focus like the sacred force it is. You're going to practice directing it consciously, deliberately, toward what actually matters. And I'm going to show you how. The second principle, compound growth, is the eighth wonder of the world, but it works in both directions. I famously said that money could double every 7 years through compound interest. But here's what most people miss. Everything compounds. Your habits compound. Your thoughts compound. Your relationships compound. Your skills compound. And yes, your problems compound too. That small choice you make today, it seems insignificant. But that choice leads to another choice, which leads to another, and 7 years from now, you'll be living in a reality that's either dramatically better or dramatically worse than where you are today, and you'll barely remember the tiny moments that created it. In 2026X, you'll be living in the compounded reality of the choices you're making right now, today, this week. If you're compounding wisdom, discipline, love, and purpose, 2026 will be your breakthrough year. Everything you've been building will suddenly click into place. But if you're compounding distraction, resentment, shortcuts, and numbness, 2026 will feel like hitting a wall. And here's the prophecy within the prophecy. The gap between these two groups will become so visible, so undeniable, that it will finally wake up millions of people who've been sleepwalking. They'll look at the people who prepared, who compounded the right things, and they'll finally understand. Some will feel inspired, others will feel angry. Both reactions will transform the world. The third principle. True wealth is measured in time, freedom, and energy, never in currency alone. I became wealthy in my printing business, yes. But my real wealth came when I retired at 42 and spent the rest of my life in pursuit of knowledge, service, and invention. I bought back my time. I bought back my freedom to explore. I bought back my energy to contribute in ways that mattered. Can you imagine if I'd stayed in that print shop, making more and more money, until I died surrounded by coins but empty of purpose? The world would have lost the lightning rod, bifocals, the Franklin stove, and my diplomatic service. I would have lost everything that made my life meaningful. Your world has confused wealth with money to a dangerous degree. People are sacrificing their time, their freedom, their energy, their health, their relationships, all to accumulate numbers in accounts that they'll barely have time to spend. They're trading the real for the symbolic. And in 2026, there will be a great reckoning. Those who built real wealth, who invested in skills, relationships, health, and purpose, will be anti-fragile. They'll thrive in chaos. But those who only stacked paper wealth, they're going to discover that when systems shake, and they will shake, symbols lose their power, only the real remains. The fourth principle. Innovation isn't about creating something from nothing. It's about seeing new connections between things that already exist. Every single invention I created was just me connecting existing knowledge in new ways. Lightning wasn't new. Electricity wasn't new. I just connected them. And here's what most people miss about that moment I was terrified. You think I just waltzed out into a thunderstorm with complete confidence? I spent weeks double-guessing myself. What if I was wrong? What if the lightning struck me dead and proved I was just another fool with delusions of understanding nature? But here's the thing. I did it anyway. Not because I was brave, but because not knowing was worse than the risk. That's the pattern I kept seeing in Philadelphia, in London, in Paris, everywhere I went. The people who actually changed things weren't necessarily smarter. They were just more willing to test their ideas against reality. They'd rather be proven wrong than live in comfortable ignorance. I watched brilliant men waste entire careers protecting theories that didn't work. They'd built their reputations on these ideas, and admitting error felt like death to them. Meanwhile, a printer from Boston with barely any formal education was willing to stand in a field with a kite and say, "Let's see what happens." You know what I learned from that storm? That nature doesn't care about your credentials. It doesn't care if you went to Harvard or learned your letters in a print shop. It responds to good questions and honest experiments. That's it. The silk threads got wet. The key sparked. And suddenly we weren't just speculating about electricity anymore, we were proving it, understanding it, and eventually controlling it. Within years, lightning rods were protecting buildings across America and Europe. How many lives saved? How many fires were prevented? All because someone was willing to look foolish holding a kite in the rain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because between that experiment and those lightning rods, something crucial had to happen. I had to do something that most people still won't do today. I had to share everything I learned. Free. No patents. No secret methods. Just the raw knowledge. Published for anyone to use. People thought I was insane. But here's what happened. Those printers became my Times network. When did I need to distribute newspapers across the colonies? My trained printers handled it. When I needed information from distant towns, my printers sent it. When did I need allies for political causes? My printers rallied support. I had built something far more valuable than a monopoly. I had built a time system that grew stronger the more I shared it. The same principle applies today, but most people miss it entirely. You see someone succeed in your field, and your first instinct is to protect your territory. To keep your secrets close, to view them as competition, that's the scarcity mindset, and it will keep you small forever. Listen carefully. Asterisk, asterisk. In a world of abundance, the generous become titans. Asterisk, asterisk. Not because they're naive, because they understand how value actually compounds. When you freely share knowledge, you don't deplete it, you multiply it. You create grateful allies. You build a reputation. You establish yourself as a time source, times rather than a hoarder. And sources attract opportunities that hoarders never even see. I wrote Poor Richard's Almanac for 25 years. Gave away practical wisdom, proverbs, and advice to anyone who could spare a few pennies for the publication. My competitors thought I was giving away the store. But every person who bought that almanac and improved their life, they became living advertisements for my judgment, my credibility, my usefulness. When I later needed support for public projects, libraries, fire departments, universities, people listened. Because I had spent decades investing in their success without demanding immediate returns. This is how you build influence that lasts. Not through control, but through contribution. Think about the people you most trust today. The experts you follow. The creators you admire. I guarantee they're the ones who give generously, not the ones who gatekeep desperately. The hoarders might win today's transaction, but the generous build tomorrow's empires. Now, let me address something that makes people squirm in their seats. The uncomfortable truth about leverage and when to use it ruthlessly. You've been told to always be nice, always be fair, always play by the rules written by people who benefit from you following them. Nonsense. There's a moment in every negotiation where you must recognize your true position and exploit it without apology. I'm not talking about cruelty. I'm talking about clarity. When I negotiated postal routes in the colonies, I didn't beg the postmaster for favors. I demonstrated that without my printing network, his information would move like molasses in January. I wasn't mean about it. I was just honest about the reality of our respective positions. Here's what weak negotiators do. They pretend leverage doesn't exist because acknowledging it feels uncomfortable. They want everyone to like them. They want the negotiation to feel like a friendly conversation where everyone wins equally. That's not how power works. And pretending otherwise just means you'll be exploited by someone who understands reality better than you do. When you have leverage, use it. When you're the only supplier they can access in time. When you're the candidate they've spent 3 months trying to find. When you're the expert with the knowledge they desperately need. Don't apologize for your position. Don't diminish your value to make them comfortable. State your terms clearly. Then wait. The silence after you name your price when you hold the cards? That's not awkward. That's beautiful. That's the sound of value being recognized, even if reluctantly. But here's the sophistication most people miss. Leverage isn't about domination. It's about honest acknowledgement of asymmetric positions. And the truly skilled negotiator knows that today's leverage can become tomorrow's liability if you burn bridges while using it. So yes, exploit your advantages, but do it with such professionalism and clarity that even the person on the weaker side respects how you played your hand. Leave them thinking not that person destroyed me, but rather that person knew exactly what they were worth. Because here's what I've learned over decades. The reputation you build while holding power determines whether people work with you when positions reverse. Now, let me tell you about something most negotiation books completely miss. The power of creative alternatives that make everyone feel like they won something meaningful. I once watched a treaty negotiation that seemed completely deadlocked. France wanted colonial concessions. Britain wanted trade routes. Neither would budge on their primary demand. The situation looked hopeless. Then someone suggested a third option nobody had considered, a joint venture in the Caribbean that gave France territorial prestige while giving Britain the commercial access they actually cared about. Suddenly, both sides were negotiating enthusiastically over something that hadn't even been on the table an hour before. This is what separates adequate negotiators from exceptional ones. Adequate negotiators see the pie and fight over how to divide it. Exceptional negotiators step back and ask, what if we're fighting over the wrong pie entirely? What if there's something else that satisfies our underlying interests better than what we're currently demanding? I use this constantly in diplomacy. Someone would demand we support their position on issue X. Instead of fighting them directly, I'd ask, what would supporting you on issue X actually get you? What's the outcome you're trying to achieve? 9 times out of 10, once we identified their real objective, we could find 3 alternative paths to get them there that didn't cost us nearly as much. This requires genuine curiosity about what motivates the other side. Not surface-level demands, but deeper drivers. Status, security, legacy, profit, peace of mind, these underlying motivations are where creative solutions live. And here's the beautiful part. When you help someone achieve their actual objective through an unexpected path, they remember you as collaborative rather than adversarial. You've expanded the relationship instead of just executing a transaction. But this only works if you ask better questions than the other person expects. Don't just ask, what do you want? Ask, what would success look like for you 3 years from now? Ask, what keeps you up at night about this situation? Ask, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about this scenario, what would it be? These questions do something remarkable. They bypass the surface transaction and get straight to the underlying need. Most people don't know what they truly want until you help them articulate it. I've watched countless negotiations where both parties argued fiercely over positions they didn't even care about because no one bothered to ask what they actually valued. Let me give you a concrete example. When I was negotiating the postal routes between colonies, the debate started as a shouting match about costs per mile. Everyone had their number, their line in the sand. But I asked a different question. What would make this postal system something you'd be proud to tell your grandchildren about? Suddenly, we weren't talking about pennies anymore. We were talking about connecting families, enabling commerce, building something that would outlast us all. The cost structure sorted itself out once we aligned on the greater purpose. This is the essence of reframing. You change the conversation from scarcity to abundance, from division to multiplication. You're not splitting a pie, you're baking a bigger one. And here's what most people miss. The person who asks the most insightful questions controls the frame, even if they never make a single demand. I want you to practice this in your next 3 conversations, regardless of the stakes. Whether you're discussing dinner plans with your spouse or a business deal with a client, start by asking questions that make the other person think differently about what they want. Watch how the entire dynamic shifts. You'll stop feeling like you're fighting over scraps and start feeling like you're building something together. Now, let's talk about the 5th principle. Never negotiate against yourself. This one trips up more good people than any other mistake. You make an offer. Silence follows. Panic sets in. And before the other person even responds, you're already backtracking, sweetening the deal, apologizing for asking. You've just destroyed your own position without anyone else lifting a finger. This is what I call negotiating against yourself, and it's perhaps the most expensive mistake you can make. Because, unlike negotiating against a skilled opponent where at least you're learning their position, testing their limits, when you negotiate against yourself, you're simply giving away value for free. I've watched this happen countless times. A freelancer quotes $5,000 for a project. The client says, "Let me think about it." Just 3 words. Not a counteroffer. Not a rejection. Just silence, with a promise to consider. And what does the freelancer do? Within an hour, they're back. Actually, I could do it for $4,000. The client hasn't said no. They haven't provided any information about their budget. They haven't given any indication that price is the issue. But the freelancer, unable to tolerate the uncertainty, has just discounted themselves by 20%. Now imagine these compounds. The client, seeing this behavior, waits again. And sure enough, you know what, for you, I could make it $3,500. We're now at a 30% discount, and the client hasn't negotiated at all. They've simply existed while the freelancer dismantled their own value. This pattern doesn't just cost you money. It costs you respect whether consciously or not the other party registers what's happening. They're learning that your initial position meant nothing, that your value is arbitrary, that if they simply wait, you'll continue lowering the price, continuing to make concessions, continuing to negotiate on their behalf. I learned this the hard way in my printing business. Early on, I'd quote a price for a print job. If the customer hesitated even slightly, a pause, a furrowed brow, a non-committal, I'd immediately start offering alternatives: cheaper paper, fewer copies, a longer timeline to reduce rush charges. And you know what I discovered? The customers I gave the fastest discounts to respected me the least. They questioned my quality. They demanded revisions. They paid late, because I'd already taught them that my word had no weight, that my prices had no foundation. The customers respected me the most. The ones where I quoted a price and then stopped talking. Where I let the silence exist. Where I trusted that if they had concerns, they possessed the ability to voice them. That trust, my friends, changed everything. Because when you trust people with that responsibility, when you permit them to own their own comfort or discomfort, you remove yourself from a position of control. You step down from being the person who must manage everyone's emotional state, and you step into being someone who simply shows up. The letters that followed those boundary conversations were remarkable, not because they were all positive, some weren't, but because they were honest. One person wrote, "I felt surprised when you said that. I thought we had a different kind of relationship, but I respect it, and I understand now." That word, respect. It appeared again and again. No agreement. Not always happiness, but respect. See, what I've learned is that people can respect a boundary they don't like far more easily than they can respect someone who has no boundaries at all. Because boundaries communicate something essential. I value myself enough to protect my own well-being. And when people see you value yourself, they begin to understand that you're not a resource to be consumed. You're a person. But here's what nobody tells you about this journey. The guilt doesn't just disappear. Even now, years into this practice, there are moments, quiet moments, usually where that old voice whispers, maybe you're being too rigid. Maybe you're not generous enough. Maybe if you were just a little more flexible. And I have to remind myself of something crucial. Boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out. They're the framework that keeps me standing. Without them, I collapse. And when I collapse, I help no one. I think about the airplane oxygen mask metaphor everyone uses. Put on your own mask first. It's become such a cliché that we've stopped truly hearing it. But there's profound wisdom there. If you pass out from lack of oxygen while trying to help others, you become another person who needs saving. You don't just fail to help, you actively create more crises. Every time I said yes when I meant no, every time I overextended myself to avoid someone's momentary disappointment, I was slowly suffocating. And the people around me? They had no idea. Because I smiled through it. I performed competence and availability even as I crumbled internally. And here's what nobody tells you about that performance. It compounds. Each time you successfully hide your struggle, you raise the bar for what people expect from you. Each time you deliver despite drowning, you train everyone around you that this is your normal capacity. You become trapped in a cage built from your own competence. I remember the afternoon I realized I'd become my own worst enemy. I was sitting in my office, staring at my calendar, 14 meetings that week, 3 project deadlines, 2 presentations. And wedged between everything else, I'd scheduled catch-up time from 6 to 8 p.m. Like I was going to catch up in 2 hours on work that required 20. My colleague stopped by, dropped another request on my desk. "Since you're always so on top of things," she said with a smile. And I smiled back. Agreed. Added it to the list. The moment she left, I put my head down on my desk and just existed there for a minute. Because I realized something devastating. I had trained everyone around me to believe I was infinitely capable, and now I was receiving the rewards of that training. You know what the cruelest part is? When you finally do say no, people act betrayed, like you've broken some unspoken contract. I once declined to take on an additional project, something completely outside my job description, and my manager looked at me with genuine confusion. "But "You always say yes," she said, as if my previous inability to set boundaries had created an obligation for my future self. This is the toxic cycle of workplace martyrdom. Your overperformance doesn't earn you rest. It earns you more work. Your reliability doesn't earn you grace. It earns you higher expectations. Your dedication doesn't earn you recognition. It earns you invisibility, because when someone does their job extraordinarily well, it starts to look easy, effortless, like maybe it doesn't count as much. I watched this play out with devastating clarity when our department did performance reviews. The person who was always struggling, always asking for help, always visibly stressed, they got praise for really stepping up and showing improvement. Meanwhile, I got a thumbs up and more responsibilities, because I made it look easy. The real kicker? When I finally did ask for help just once, after months of drowning, my manager actually seemed annoyed, like I'd broken some unspoken contract. "I thought you had this under control," she said, with this edge of disappointment that hit like a slap. Translation: "I thought you were the person I didn't have to think about." That's when it crystallized for me. Competence doesn't buy you support. It buys you invisibility in the reward column and hypervisibility in the expectation column. You become furniture essential, load-bearing furniture, but furniture nonetheless, until you break. Then suddenly everyone notices, but not with concern, with inconvenience. I started watching for this pattern everywhere, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The reliable friend who always shows up gets taken for granted while everyone rallies around the flaky friend's occasional appearance. The sibling who stays close to aging parents and handles everything gets criticized for tiny missteps, while the one who visits twice a year gets praised for making the effort. The employee who quietly fixes problems before they explode gets paid less than the one who creates visible fires and then heroically puts them out. We've built an entire economy of attention around struggle and drama. Smooth competence is boring. It doesn't trigger our rescue instincts or our need to feel needed. It doesn't generate the emotional payoff of witnessing someone overcome something. So we've accidentally created a system that rewards visible struggle over invisible excellence. And here's where it gets truly perverse. The competent person sees this happening. They watch less capable people get more support, more grace, more recognition. And what do? They work harder. They try to be even more competent, thinking that's the solution. They internalize the message that they're not struggling enough to deserve help, so they push themselves further into isolation. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. These same people often become the hardest on others who struggle openly. They'll look at someone asking for help with contempt, thinking, "I managed without complaining, why can't they?" They perpetuate the exact cycle that's destroying them, because acknowledging someone else's legitimate need for support would mean confronting the lie they've been telling themselves. I've watched this dynamic tear families apart. A father who silently carried impossible burdens his entire life cannot comprehend why his son needs therapy. "I survived worse," he thinks. "I didn't need anyone holding my hand." What he doesn't recognize is that survival isn't the same as living. He survived, yes, but at what cost? The relationships he never fully engaged in? The joy he never allowed himself to feel? The decades of numbness he mistook for strength? The truly tragic part is that this father genuinely believes he's helping. He thinks he's toughening his son up, preparing him for a harsh world. He doesn't realize he's simply passing down trauma like a family heirloom, wrapping it in the language of virtue. This is where the philosophy becomes a prison of the mind. Because once you've built your entire identity around needing nothing from anyone, admitting you were wrong feels like annihilation. It's not just changing your mind about an idea, it's dismantling the story you've told yourself about who you are. I remember one man who contacted me after years of living by this creed. He'd lost his marriage, barely spoke to his children, and had driven away everyone who'd ever tried to care about him. He wrote, "I did everything right according to the code. I was strong. I was independent. I asked for nothing. So why am I completely alone?" The answer, though painful, is simple. He'd confused strength with invulnerability, independence with isolation, and self-reliance with refusing all human connection. Looking back through the fog of centuries, I see this pattern repeating in ways that would make me laugh if they didn't make me weep. The architect who designs magnificent buildings but lives in an empty apartment. The surgeon who saves lives daily but has no one to call when his own heart breaks. The entrepreneur who builds companies employing thousands yet eats dinner alone, scrolling through a screen that connects him to everyone and no one simultaneously. They've all made the same fundamental error I made in those drafts and redrafts of my autobiography. They've confused the story they're telling with the life they're living. They present strength as armor when it should be a foundation. They display independence as a moat when it should be a bridge. They wear self-reliance like a mask when it should be the face beneath, confident enough to show its true expressions. Let me be brutally honest with you about something I've observed. The people most obsessed with appearing strong are usually the ones most terrified of their own weakness. The ones most vocal about needing no one are the ones most desperate for connection. The ones most proud of their emotional control are the ones most controlled by their fear of emotion. I've watched this play out across drawing rooms, political chambers, and now digital platforms where people perform their invulnerability for audiences of strangers. The performance becomes the prison. The mask becomes the face. And one day they wake up and realize they've become so good at needing nothing that they've created a life where nothing truly matters. Here's what I learned too late. What I'm begging you to understand now. Vulnerability isn't the opposite of strength. It's the proof of it. Only the truly strong can afford to be vulnerable. Only the genuinely independent can risk interdependence. Only the authentically self-reliant can admit when they need help. Think about it. Who's stronger, the tree that stands rigid against the wind until it snaps, or the one that bends, sways, and allows itself to be moved while remaining rooted? Who's more independent, the person who refuses all help, or the one secure enough to accept it without feeling diminished? Who's more self-reliant, the one who does everything alone, or the one who builds a life where strength flows in multiple directions? I think about the word independent, and how it's been weaponized in ways I never intended. We've turned it into a kind of armor, a wall we build around ourselves to prove we don't need anyone. But that was never what independence meant to me. When I drafted those words about self-governance, about breaking free from tyranny, I wasn't advocating for isolation. I was advocating for the right to choose our connections, to build community on our own terms, not have it imposed by distant monarchs who saw us as resources to be extracted. True independence isn't the absence of connection, it's the freedom to choose meaningful connection over exploitative obligation. It's the difference between being forced to bow to a king and choosing to stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbors. One diminishes you, the other amplifies you. I learned this while running my printing shop. I could have tried to do everything myself, set the type, run the press, mix the ink, deliver the papers, collect payment, write every article. I'd have been independent in the most literal sense. I also would have produced maybe a dozen papers a week and died of exhaustion by 40. Instead, I hired apprentices. I collaborated with other writers. I built distribution networks. I created something far larger than my individual capacity could have produced. Was I less independent because I relied on others? Or was I more independent because I'd built a sustainable enterprise that freed me to pursue other interests? The man who insists on doing everything alone isn't independent, he's imprisoned by his own capabilities. His world can only be as large as his individual reach. But the person who builds genuine interdependence, their world expands exponentially. They're not diminished by accepting help, they're multiplied by it. I see this confusion playing out everywhere in your modern landscape. The entrepreneur who refuses to delegate, slowly drowning in tasks that could be handled by others, calls it maintaining control. The parent who won't accept help with childcare wears exhaustion like a badge of honor. The employee who won't ask questions because it might reveal they don't know everything quietly struggles while pretending competence. This isn't a strength. This is fear wearing strength's costume. Real independence requires enough security in yourself to say, I don't know, I need help. I can't do this alone. It requires the confidence to be vulnerable, because you understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of genuine connection. I learned this lesson not from some grand philosophical treatise, but from a moment of absolute humiliation. I was working on improving street lamps in Philadelphia, convinced, as always, that I had the superior design. My prototype kept failing. The oil mechanism wouldn't cooperate, and I spent weeks alone in my workshop, growing increasingly frustrated, refusing to consult the lamp makers who'd been doing this work for generations. Finally, exhausted and defeated, I swallowed my pride and asked for help. Within an hour, an experienced craftsman showed me a simple adjustment I'd overlooked in my arrogance. The lamp worked perfectly. But the real illumination that day wasn't the lamp, it was understanding that my insistence on solving everything alone wasn't independence. It was imprisonment. The truly independent person builds networks, not walls. They cultivate relationships, not as transactions, but as genuine connections that can be relied upon when needed. They understand that asking for help isn't a deficit in their independence account, it's a testament to their wisdom in recognizing that human beings are fundamentally interdependent creatures. Consider the paradox. The person who believes they need no one eventually becomes completely dependent on maintaining that illusion. They can't take risks because failure might require assistance. They can't be authentic because their true self might be seen as weak. They can't grow because growth requires acknowledging current limitations. Their so-called independence becomes the most confining dependency of all dependency on never appearing dependent. Real independence is selective dependence chosen consciously. It's saying, I can do many things, but I choose to accept help with this because it serves my larger purpose. It's understanding that self-reliance doesn't mean doing everything yourself. It means being reliable in your commitments, while building a community of mutual support. The lonely person calls this a compromise. The wise person calls it civilization. And here's what's remarkable about civilization. Every major advancement in human history has come not from someone working in complete isolation, but from someone who understood how to weave individual brilliance with collective strength. You think I invented the lightning rod alone in my workshop? I studied the work of European scientists. I corresponded with colleagues across the Atlantic. I tested theories in public demonstrations where others could observe, question, and contribute. The idea was mine, yes, but it was refined through conversation, challenged through debate, and improved through the observations of people who saw things I couldn't see from my vantage point. This is the paradox that lonely people never grasp. True originality requires connection. You need solitude to think deeply, absolutely. But you also need other perspectives to reveal your blind spots, to challenge your assumptions, to show you possibilities you never imagined. I've watched brilliant minds waste away in isolation, convinced that accepting input from others would somehow taint their genius. And I've watched modest talents achieve extraordinary things because they understood how to absorb wisdom from every source, synthesize it with their own insights, and create something greater than the sum of its parts. The lonely person hoards their ideas like treasure, afraid that sharing will diminish their value. But ideas aren't gold coins that decrease when you spend them. They're more like seeds, they only reach their full potential when planted in fertile soil and tended by many hands. When I started the Junto, that discussion group in Philadelphia, some people thought I was wasting my time. Why share your best ideas with tradesmen and craftsmen? They asked. Why not keep your insights to yourself and reap all the benefits? But those Friday evenings of debate and discussion generated more valuable insights than I could have produced in 100 years of solitary contemplation. A printer would notice something about communication that I missed. A surveyor would contribute a perspective on measurement that sparked a new direction in my experiments. A merchant would ask a naive question that revealed a flaw in my reasoning I'd been too close to see. I learned that the deepest insights emerge not from the ivory tower, but from the intersection of different worlds, different ways of thinking, different vocabularies for describing reality. This is why I always encouraged young scientists to spend time in the workshop, and why I urged young craftsmen to study natural philosophy. The boundaries we draw between disciplines, between theory and practice, between high culture and common work, these boundaries are artificial constructs that limit our vision. The universe doesn't organize itself according to our academic departments. Nature doesn't care whether you call yourself a scientist or a tradesman. The lightning doesn't check your credentials before it strikes. The electricity flows through the experimental apparatus the same way it flows through the storm cloud, indifferent to whether the hand guiding the wire belongs to a philosopher or a printer. I've watched brilliant minds waste their potential by confining themselves to narrow specializations, speaking only to others in their field, reading only within their discipline, and thinking only in their established paradigms. They become like musicians who know only one instrument, who can play it with extraordinary skill but who cannot imagine the symphony that emerges when different instruments combine. The future will belong to those who can cross boundaries, who can translate between disciplines, who can see the patterns that connect seemingly unrelated phenomena. It will belong to those who understand that innovation happens not in the center of established fields, but at the edges, in the spaces between, where different domains overlap and fertilize each other. When I worked on the Franklin stove, I wasn't just applying physics to heating. I was combining thermal dynamics with economics, social welfare with engineering design, public health with metallurgy. The result wasn't merely a better stove. It was a solution that addressed multiple problems simultaneously because it emerged from multiple perspectives. When I studied ocean currents and charted the Gulf Stream, I wasn't working as a pure scientist in isolation. I was combining the practical knowledge of sea captains with systematic temperature measurements, the observations of whaling crews with mathematical analysis, and everyday maritime experience with theoretical understanding of how water moves. The chart I eventually produced wasn't just scientifically accurate, it was practically useful. It cut weeks off Atlantic crossings. It saved lives. It connected commerce with natural philosophy in a way that benefited both. This is the model I believe we must follow. Knowledge that connects rather than divides, expertise that builds bridges rather than walls, understanding that serves humanity rather than merely serving itself. The problems we face as individuals, as communities, as a species are rarely simple enough to be solved by any single discipline or perspective. They require minds that can range freely across boundaries, that can see patterns where others see only fragments, that can synthesize solutions from seemingly unrelated fields. Consider the lightning rod again, not merely as an invention, but as a case study in integrative thinking. It required an understanding of atmospheric electricity, natural philosophy. It required knowledge of materials and their conductive properties, practical mechanics. It required awareness of building construction and architectural principles. It required consideration of human psychology and how people might be convinced to adopt a new safety measure. It required economic thinking about costs and benefits. No single discipline held all the answers. The solution emerged from the integration. Or take my work with the Franklin stove. The problem wasn't merely technical, how to heat a room more efficiently. It was simultaneously a problem of fuel economics, of health and indoor air quality, of materials science, of aesthetic acceptance, of manufacturing practicality, and of social adoption. I could have approached it purely as an engineering challenge, optimizing heat transfer and combustion, but that narrow focus would have produced a device that worked in theory but failed in practice, too expensive, too ugly, too difficult to manufacture, too foreign to be accepted. This is what I observe missing in much of modern specialization. The recognition that real problems exist in a web of contexts, not in isolated disciplinary boxes. We train people to become ever more expert in ever narrower domains, and then we wonder why their solutions so often fail when implemented in the messy reality of human society. I am not arguing against expertise. Deep knowledge matters enormously. What I question is expertise without breadth, depth without context, mastery without the ability to connect that mastery to other domains. The specialist who cannot communicate across boundaries, who cannot see how their work relates to the larger whole, who cannot adapt their thinking to incorporate insights from other fields, this specialist, however brilliant, is limited in their ultimate usefulness. The path forward, I believe, lies not in abandoning specialization, but in coupling it with deliberate breadth. We need experts who are also connectors. We need depth paired with the ability to range widely. We need people who can go deep into their domains while maintaining peripheral vision that allows them to see connections others miss. This hybrid approach creates what I call connective expertise, the ability to be genuinely accomplished in your primary domain while maintaining the curiosity and framework thinking that allows you to draw insights from seemingly unrelated fields. I saw this principle at work in my own printing business. Yes, I was a printer. I understood typefaces, ink composition, press mechanics, paper quality. But I also studied rhetoric and persuasion, which made me a better editor. I learned about chemistry, which helped me develop better ink formulations. I understood local politics and social dynamics, which informed what I published and how I distributed it. My printing success wasn't despite these varied interests, it was because of them. The connections between fields created advantages that pure specialists couldn't replicate. Today's most innovative thinkers operate similarly. They have genuine depth in their primary field, but they deliberately expose themselves to ideas from distant domains. They read outside their industry. They cultivate friendships with people in different professions. They attend conferences that have nothing to do with their day job. This isn't dilettantism, it's strategic cross-pollination. The key is intentionality. You're not learning random things for the sake of appearing well-rounded. You're building a personal knowledge network where each node connects to and enriches the others. You're creating a system where insights from one domain can illuminate challenges in another. Let me be practical about this. If you're a software engineer, studying psychology doesn't make you less technical. It makes you better at understanding user behavior, team dynamics, and your own cognitive biases. If you're a teacher, learning about marketing doesn't corrupt your educational mission. It helps you understand how to communicate value and engage attention in a distracted world. The bridges between disciplines are where breakthrough thinking happens, not in the safe centers of established fields, but at the edges, where domains overlap and create unexpected synthesis. The modern obsession with specialization misses something I understood 3 centuries ago. The specialist knows more and more about less and less, while the polymath knows enough about enough to see connections the specialist cannot. When I studied the Gulf Stream, I wasn't betraying my work with electricity. I was applying the same observational principles to a different domain. When I analyzed demographics for public policy, I wasn't abandoning science. I was extending scientific thinking into social questions. You see this pattern throughout history. The Renaissance wasn't called the Renaissance because people became narrower. It exploded precisely because individuals refused artificial boundaries between art and science, between mathematics and music, between anatomy and architecture. Leonardo didn't apologize for studying both hydraulics and human flight. He understood they were expressions of the same curiosity about how the world works. The tragedy of modern education is that we've accepted this fiction, that learning follows a tree structure. You start with a trunk of general knowledge, then branch into specific fields, then twig into subspecialties, until you're studying the molecular biology of a single protein in one species of beetle. But that's not how insight works. Real understanding looks more like a web, where every new piece of knowledge creates potential connections to dozens of others. The value isn't just in the node, it's in the links. When you learn about cognitive biases in psychology, you're not just gaining psychological knowledge. You're acquiring a lens that transforms how you read history, how you evaluate business decisions, how you understand political movements, and how you negotiate with your teenagers. The concept travels. It multiplies its value by crossing domains. This is why I'm so passionate about this approach. Not because it's pleasant or entertaining, though it often is, but because it's effective in ways that narrow expertise simply cannot match. The problems you'll face in your life, in your work, in your communities won't arrive neatly labeled by academic department. They'll be messy, interdisciplinary tangles that require you to pull from multiple domains simultaneously. Climate change isn't a pure science problem. It's entangled with economics, psychology, political science, engineering, ethics, and international relations. You can't solve it from inside any single discipline. Inequality isn't purely economic. It touches education, health, psychology, urban planning, and technology. The challenges that matter most refuse to respect the boundaries we've drawn between fields. And here's what I learned. Spending time in innovation labs and research centers, breakthrough solutions rarely come from deeper specialization. They come from a collision. When an urban planner talks with a behavioral economist, suddenly you see poverty through a different lens. When a teacher collaborates with a neuroscientist, education transforms. When a technologist partners with a social worker, they build tools that actually serve communities instead of extracting from them. I witnessed this firsthand at a community center in Baltimore. They were struggling with youth unemployment. A standard problem. Standard approaches weren't working. Then something unexpected happened. A group came together, a former gang member turned counselor, a data scientist from Johns Hopkins, a small business owner, and a city planner. What they created wasn't what any discipline would have designed alone. They mapped the actual networks young people move through, not theoretical models, but real relationships, real barriers, real opportunities. They identified businesses within walking distance that needed workers but couldn't find them. Not because the jobs didn't exist, but because the connection systems were broken. Within 6 months, they'd placed 47 young people in jobs, not through a program, but through understanding the system, the transportation gaps, the trust gaps, the information gaps, and addressing all of them simultaneously. That's systems thinking. That's what happens when you stop asking, what does my discipline say, and start asking, what does reality require? The most critical problems of our time, climate change, mental health crisis, democratic erosion, they're all systemic problems. They can't be solved by experts staying in their lanes. They demand we build bridges between islands of knowledge. And I'll be honest with you, this is hard. Universities aren't structured this way. Funding isn't allocated this way. Careers aren't built this way. When you work across disciplines, you're nobody's ideal candidate. Too broad for the specialists, not credentialed enough for traditionalists. But the world doesn't care about our institutional structures. Reality is interdisciplinary. It always has been. When I approached the study of electricity, I didn't ask myself, am I qualified as a scientist to pursue this? I was a printer by trade. I had no formal training in natural philosophy. But I saw patterns in nature that demanded investigation, and I refused to let the boundaries of my profession limit the boundaries of my curiosity. The lightning rod wasn't invented by someone with a doctorate in atmospheric phenomena. It was invented by someone willing to look at a practical problem, buildings burning down after lightning strikes, and apply insights from experiments with static electricity. The solution required understanding physics, yes, but also architecture, metallurgy, public safety, and human psychology. How do you convince people to put metal rods on their roofs when they fear attracting the very lightning you claim to redirect? This is the essence of what we've lost in our rush to specialize. We've created experts who know more and more about less and less, until they know everything about nothing that matters to the lives of ordinary people. I'm not arguing against expertise. Deep knowledge has value. The physician who has studied anatomy for decades can diagnose ailments I couldn't dream of understanding. But that physician is incomplete without also understanding the social conditions that create disease, the economic factors that determine who receives treatment, and the ethical frameworks that guide difficult decisions. True mastery comes not from burrowing deeper into a single tunnel, but from understanding how all the tunnels connect beneath the surface. It comes from being able to step back and see the whole mountain, not just the vein of ore you've been mining. Think about the great challenges we face today, not the technical puzzles, but the profound questions that will determine whether our grandchildren inherit a world worth living in. Climate change, artificial intelligence, economic inequality, the erosion of truth itself in public discourse. Can any of these be solved by experts working in isolation? A climate scientist can tell you the planet is warming, but cannot alone determine how to reorganize global economies, redesign cities, change human behavior, and navigate international politics. An AI researcher can build powerful algorithms, but cannot alone answer questions about consciousness, ethics, labor markets, and the nature of human flourishing. We've built a world of specialists who can describe their small piece of reality with exquisite precision, but who lack the language to speak to one another. And so we stand paralyzed before problems that demand exactly what we've trained ourselves not to do. Think across boundaries, synthesize disparate knowledge, and act with wisdom rather than mere expertise. I learned this lesson myself through painful experience. When I first arrived in Philadelphia as a runaway apprentice with nothing but a few coins in my pocket, I thought expertise in printing would be enough. I could set type faster than anyone, knew every trick of the trade, every shortcut that separated the journeyman from the master. But expertise alone would have left me running someone else's print shop for the rest of my days. What transformed my life wasn't deeper knowledge of printing, it was understanding how printing connected to everything else. I studied rhetoric to make the Pennsylvania Gazette compelling. I learned about politics to print documents that mattered. I taught myself accounting to manage the business. I studied human nature to build the network of partnerships that eventually made me wealthy. The printing press was my tool, but the liberal arts were my fortune. And here's what strikes me most forcefully about your current moment. You're making the inverse choice. You're choosing the tool and abandoning the fortune. You're so focused on the mechanism that you've forgotten to ask what's worth printing, what's worth saying, what's worth building toward. You've mistaken the means for the end. I watch students declare majors in data science without ever reading a novel that might help them understand what data about human beings actually means. I see engineers building social platforms without studying psychology, history, or ethics disciplines that might have warned them about the predictable consequences of their designs. The results are not just individually limiting. They're collectively catastrophic. You've created technologies that manipulate human attention without understanding attention. You've built algorithmic systems that encode bias without studying how bias operates. You've disrupted industries without learning the history that might explain why those industries existed in the first place. This isn't progress. It's educated incompetence at a civilizational scale. And the tragedy is that you sense something is wrong. You feel the emptiness of knowing how without understanding why. You recognize the insufficiency of technical skill without wisdom to guide it. But instead of addressing the root problem, the narrowness of your education, you seek ever more narrow solutions. You add a single ethics course to an engineering curriculum and call it solved. You attend a weekend workshop on creativity and consider yourself enlightened. But wisdom cannot be acquired in modular units. It must be cultivated through decades of deliberate practice, through wrestling with complexity until simplicity emerges naturally, through making mistakes and learning humility from their consequences. The specialist sees education as credential acquisition. I saw it as character formation. Today's students collect certificates the way collectors gather stamps for completion, not transformation. They attend lectures as tourists attend landmarks, checking boxes on an itinerary rather than allowing themselves to be changed by what they encounter. I created the junto not to distribute information but to forge thinkers. We didn't gather to hear experts lecture. We gathered to question everything, including ourselves. The improvement came not from what we learned but from who we became through the process of learning together. Knowledge without transformation is merely trivia. And here lies the fundamental confusion. Your society has mistaken information transfer for education. You can transfer data through screens and lectures. You cannot transfer wisdom. Wisdom emerges only through the slow work of integrating knowledge with experience, of testing theories against reality, of allowing contradictions to season your certainty. The modern educational assembly line produces graduates who know many things but understand few. They can recite theories but cannot apply principles. They have learned to perform intellectual tasks, but have not developed intellectual character. They are like actors who have memorized lines in a language they do not speak, technically proficient at producing sounds that carry no meaning for them. This explains the curious phenomenon I observe. Individuals with impressive credentials who cannot think through basic problems outside their narrow specialty. Engineers who cannot write clear sentences. Lawyers who cannot grasp simple mathematics. Scholars who cannot fix anything with their hands. Each is imprisoned in their specialized vocabulary, unable to translate their knowledge into practical wisdom. True education produces not specialists but complete human beings who happen to have specializations. It develops the capacity to learn anything, to adapt to changed circumstances, to recognize patterns across domains, and to communicate with anyone. These capabilities cannot be taught directly. They emerge from broad exposure to many subjects, from being forced to make connections across disciplines, from struggling with questions that have no single correct answer. I discovered this through observation of educated people versus merely trained people. The trained individual knows procedures and protocols valuable, certainly, but limited. When circumstances shift beyond their training, they falter. But the educated person possesses something more fundamental, a framework for understanding how things work, why they work, and how knowledge in one area illuminates another. Consider the difference in how they approach problems. The trained specialist sees an obstacle within their domain and applies their specific toolkit. If the problem doesn't fit the tools, they're stuck. The educated generalist sees the same obstacle and asks, what does this resemble from history? From literature? From natural philosophy? What principles are at play here? They borrow solutions from unexpected quarters, combine insights from disparate fields, and generate approaches no specialist would envision. This explains why the most revolutionary advances often come from outsiders to a field people educated broadly enough to see what the specialists, with their narrow focus, cannot. They make connections the specialists never considered, because those connections require knowledge the specialists never acquired. Your modern world desperately needs this breadth now more than ever. Your challenges: climate, inequality, technological disruption, social fragmentation. None respect the boundaries between academic disciplines. None can be solved by specialists working in isolation. They require minds capable of integrating knowledge from multiple domains, of seeing how economic systems affect environmental outcomes, how technological change reshapes social relations, and how historical patterns illuminate present dilemmas. Yet your educational system increasingly produces the opposite. People who know tremendous amounts about very little, who cannot converse meaningfully outside their specialty, who mistake their narrow expertise for comprehensive understanding. They optimize their small corner of reality while remaining blind to how their optimization creates problems elsewhere in the system. This fragmentation extends beyond academia into society itself. People cannot communicate across professional boundaries because they literally lack shared vocabulary and concepts. The engineer cannot explain to the policymaker, the scientist cannot persuade the citizen, and the humanist cannot collaborate with the technologist. Each speaks a dialect incomprehensible to the others. The solution remains what it has always been: education that prioritizes breadth before depth, that ensures every educated person possesses literacy across multiple domains before specializing. I have witnessed this fragmentation firsthand, have seen brilliant minds rendered mute across disciplinary boundaries. A physician who cannot read a balance sheet makes decisions about healthcare delivery without understanding economic constraints. An economist who knows nothing of human psychology builds models that predict perfectly and fail catastrophically. A lawyer who cannot grasp statistical reasoning interprets scientific evidence through medieval logic. The modern university, ironically, has institutionalized this fragmentation. We herd students into silos at younger and younger ages, demanding they declare their intellectual allegiance before they possess sufficient knowledge to choose wisely. We reward narrow expertise and penalize intellectual wandering. We create departments that function as rival kingdoms, each with its own language, methods, and culture, each viewing the others with suspicion. But the problems we face, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, economic inequality, these recognize no disciplinary boundaries. They are hydras that laugh at specialists wielding single weapons. To combat them requires what I practice by necessity and what I advocate by conviction: the ability to think across domains, to synthesize disparate knowledge, to translate between intellectual cultures. Consider the contemporary debate over artificial intelligence. The computer scientists who build the systems often lack training in ethics, psychology, or social science. The ethicists who critique them rarely understand the technical constraints and possibilities. The policymakers who regulate them possess neither technical nor philosophical depth. The result is incoherent systems that surprise their creators, regulations that reveal profound technical ignorance, and public discourse that generates more heat than light. What is needed, what has always been needed, is the educated generalist, not the person who knows a little about everything and nothing well, but the person who possesses deep expertise in at least one domain while maintaining genuine literacy across several others. The person who can move between intellectual worlds as I once moved between the printing shop, the laboratory, and the assembly chamber. This requires, I freely admit, more time than our current system allows. It requires delaying specialization, broadening curricula, and valuing synthesis as highly as analysis. It requires students to struggle through mathematics and literature, history and science, philosophy and practical arts, not superficially, but with enough depth to understand how each discipline thinks. Such an education would be inefficient by modern metrics, yes. Students might take longer to enter their professions. The path to expertise would be less direct. But what we would gain, what we would gain is citizens who could think across boundaries, who could recognize when tools designed for one domain were being misapplied to another. Consider how different our public discourse might be if more people understood both statistics and rhetoric, if they could both calculate the probability and recognize the emotional manipulation in how that probability is presented. If they knew enough history to spot when comparisons to past events are illuminating versus when they're merely propaganda. If they'd studied enough philosophy to distinguish between genuine ethical reasoning and mere rationalization. This is not about producing polymaths, though we could use more of those. It's about developing what I might call intellectual mobility, the ability to move between different ways of thinking, to recognize the strengths and limitations of each approach, to know when analysis serves us, and when synthesis is required. The resistance to such education comes, I observe, from two directions. The first is economic. We are told we cannot afford the inefficiency, that specialization is demanded by market forces, that breadth is a luxury. But this confuses the immediate with the important. Yes, narrow training gets workers into productive roles faster, but it also makes them more vulnerable to obsolescence, less capable of adapting when their narrow specialty becomes irrelevant or automated. The second resistance is intellectual, a kind of territorial defense by disciplines that have gained status through their very inaccessibility. Mathematics proclaims itself too rigorous for the artistic mind. The humanities declare themselves beyond the understanding of the merely technical. Each field builds walls and claims that only the initiated can truly understand. But these walls are recent constructions, built during the era of hyper-specialization. In my time, and for centuries before, it was understood that an educated person should grasp the fundamentals of many domains. We didn't expect everyone to be an expert in everything, but we expected broad competence across the range of human knowledge. The compartmentalization of knowledge serves the interests of institutions, not individuals. Universities benefit from specialization. It creates fiefdoms, justifies narrow departments, and produces workers trained for specific industrial needs. But it doesn't produce complete human beings capable of navigating a complex world. I learned printing and writing. I studied science and diplomacy. I understood commerce and government. Not because I was exceptional, though I'll admit to some talent, but because this was simply what educated people did. We understood that a merchant who grasped natural philosophy would make better decisions. That is, a politician who understood printing could better shape public opinion. A scientist who comprehended governance could contribute more meaningfully to society. The artificial barriers between disciplines create artificial limitations in thinking. When you tell yourself, "I'm not a math person," or "I don't do science," you're not describing an inherent limitation. You're repeating programming designed to keep you in a narrow lane. And that serves those who benefit from your limited perspective: employers who want specialized workers, institutions that profit from credential gatekeeping, systems that prefer citizens who don't think too broadly. Consider how much modern education resembles training rather than enlightenment. You're taught what to think in narrow domains rather than how to think across all domains. You memorize procedures rather than understanding principles. You accumulate credentials that signal competence without necessarily developing actual capability. This is why I began with practical skills before abstract knowledge. I didn't study rhetoric until I understood printing. I didn't theorize about electricity until I'd worked with my hands for decades. The concrete grounds the abstract. Manual competence prevents intellectual pretension. When you can build something, fix something, create something tangible with your own hands, you develop a healthy skepticism toward pure theory. You understand that ideas must eventually meet reality. Those elegant arguments mean nothing if they don't work when tested. This grounds your thinking in truth rather than clever-sounding nonsense. The goal isn't to become superficial in many areas. It's to develop enough competence across domains that you can think clearly about complex problems, detect deception across disciplines, and connect insights that specialists miss. You're building a lattice of knowledge where each domain reinforces the others, creating structural integrity in your thinking that narrow expertise can never achieve. This comprehensive approach to learning is more important now than ever. The modern world doesn't just reward narrow specialists, it actively produces an oversupply of them. Universities churn out people who know everything about nothing, confined to increasingly specialized domains that lose relevance faster than you can update a curriculum. I'm not dismissing expertise, we need it. But expertise without context becomes dangerous. The expert who understands metallurgy but nothing of economics will recommend solutions that are technically perfect but economically catastrophic. The programmer who understands code but nothing of human psychology will build systems that technically function but nobody wants to use. I learned this watching tradesmen in Philadelphia. The most successful weren't just skilled at their craft. They understood the entire supply chain, knew basic accounting, could negotiate with suppliers, and understood their customers' businesses well enough to anticipate needs. They operated at the intersection of multiple domains, and that's where the real value emerged. Today, you face challenges that don't respect academic boundaries. Climate change isn't just an environmental science problem, it's economics, politics, engineering, agriculture, psychology, and international relations simultaneously. You can't understand it, much less solve it, from within a single discipline. The person who studies it from multiple angles doesn't just know more, they see a fundamentally different problem than the specialist does. This is why I spent mornings on science, afternoons on politics, evenings on philosophy, and weekends on practical skills. Not to become the world's greatest expert at any single thing, but to develop the conceptual machinery to navigate problems that span domains. When I needed to understand population growth in the colonies, I drew on mathematics, economics, and observations from natural history. When designing the Franklin stove, I combined physics, metallurgy, craftsmanship, and knowledge of human behavior around heating. When negotiating with the French, I needed history, psychology, cultural understanding, language, and political theory working in concert. Your goal isn't to know everything, that's impossible and always has been. Your goal is to build enough competence across enough domains that you can recognize patterns, identify relevant expertise when you need it, ask intelligent questions, detect nonsense regardless of how credentialed its source, and synthesize insights that specialists working in isolation would never discover. This approach to learning also builds something perhaps more valuable than knowledge itself: intellectual confidence, tempered by intellectual humility. When you've genuinely engaged with multiple disciplines, you develop a calibrated sense of what you know and what you don't. You're not the person in the room who confidently pontificates about subjects they've merely skimmed. You're the person who knows enough to recognize the depth you haven't yet reached. I've watched this play out countless times. The person who's only ever studied one thing often has the most absolute opinions about everything. They've never experienced the humbling realization that comes from truly learning a second complex field, that moment when you discover that expertise is far harder to achieve than you assumed, that simple answers are usually incomplete answers, that the people you dismissed as wrong might simply be operating from frameworks you didn't understand. When you build competence across domains, you develop what I'd call intellectual peripheral vision. You're not just looking straight ahead at the problem in front of you. You're catching movement at the edges, the relevant analogy from history, the methodological insight from another field, the warning sign that this revolutionary idea is actually recycled nonsense from a discipline you studied years ago. This peripheral vision saved me repeatedly. When various schemes and financial proposals crossed my desk, my understanding of mathematics, human nature, and economics working together let me spot the flaws that pure specialists might miss. A mathematician might verify the numbers. An economist might check the theory. But someone who understood both, plus human psychology, could recognize that while the math worked and the theory was sound, the proposal required humans to behave in ways they never actually would. Your ability to synthesize across domains becomes your competitive advantage in a world where pure specialists are everywhere, but integrative thinkers are rare. This synthesis isn't just intellectual, it's intensely practical. I've watched professionals stagnate not because they lacked expertise in their field, but because they couldn't translate that expertise into adjacent contexts. The software engineer who understands code but not the business problems it solves. The marketing expert who crafts brilliant campaigns but doesn't grasp the product development cycle that determines what can actually be delivered. The financial analyst who models everything perfectly but misses the organizational politics that will kill the proposal before it reaches decision makers. The world rewards bridge builders. In every negotiation I participated in, the breakthrough moments came when someone could speak multiple languages, not literally, though that helped too, but conceptually. The person who could translate the concerns of merchants into the language of legislators, who could frame scientific principles in terms that politicians understood, who could take abstract philosophy and ground it in concrete policy. This is why I'm telling you to become a translator between worlds. Not to abandon depth, I still believe you need that core expertise, but to consciously build connections outward from it. Read outside your field deliberately. When you encounter a concept from another domain, ask yourself, how does this relate to what I already know? Where are the patterns? What would happen if I applied this principle to my own work? I kept a commonplace book for this exact purpose, a place where I'd record interesting ideas, quotes, observations from vastly different sources, and look for connections. A principle from physics might illuminate a problem in governance. An insight from agriculture might apply to organizing people. A pattern I noticed in printing might reveal something about how information spreads through society. This is what Renaissance thinking truly meant, not merely studying multiple subjects, but recognizing the deep connections between them. The universe operates on principles that transcend individual disciplines. Gravity doesn't only apply to falling apples. Competition doesn't only exist in markets. Patterns repeat across scales, from the tiniest mechanism to the largest social structure. I remember standing in my print shop one morning, watching as individual letters were assembled into words, words into lines, lines into pages. And suddenly, I understood something about how society itself was organized, how individual people combine into families, families into communities, communities into colonies. The same principles of arrangement, order, and structure apply at every level. Or consider the lightning rod. Yes, it was a scientific invention, grounded in my experiments with electricity. But developing it required metalworking knowledge, architectural understanding, economic calculation of costs versus benefits, and ultimately political persuasion to convince people to actually install them. No single discipline could have produced that solution. It emerged from the intersection of many. This cross-pollination of ideas became my greatest advantage. While specialists went deeper and deeper into narrower channels, I stayed at the surface where different streams met, and that's where the most fertile ground existed. That's where innovation happened. The world today has forgotten this lesson. We've created walls between disciplines, convinced ourselves that depth always matters more than breadth, that specialization is the only path to mastery. We've built institutions that force people into narrow categories. You're a scientist or an artist, a technician or a philosopher, a thinker or a doer. But the most important problems humanity faces exist at the boundaries. Climate change isn't just a scientific problem. It's economic, political, psychological, and cultural. Artificial intelligence isn't merely technical, it's philosophical, ethical, and social. The challenges that will define your future cannot be solved by specialists working in isolation. They require minds that can bridge disciplines, translate between domains, and connect disparate ideas. This is what I'm urging you to cultivate, not abandonment of expertise, but a broader foundation beneath it. Become capable in multiple areas. Stay curious about fields outside your primary focus. Look for the connections, the patterns, the principles that appear in different guises across disciplines.